She is one of the greatest performers who ever lived. She sold more concert tickets than any other solo performer in history. She had legs insured by Lloyd's of London, a voice that filled arenas, and an energy on stage that made people feel they were watching something miraculous. But behind all of that were two marriages, one that almost destroyed her, and one that, after decades of waiting, finally gave her what she had always deserved. The story of how she survived the first one and found the second is one of the most extraordinary personal journeys in music history. This is the story of Tina Turner's two husbands. Anna Mae Bullock. Before she was Tina Turner, she was Anna Mae Bullock, a girl from Nutbush, Tennessee, born on November 26, 1939, into circumstances that the word modest barely covers. Her father, Floyd Bullock, was a sharecropper who oversaw crops on a farm in Haywood County, Tennessee. Her mother, Zelma Curry, worked alongside him. It was the American South in the early 1940s, shaped by the specific grinding weight of poverty, racial segregation, and agricultural labor that offered no path upward and no safety net below. The family lived in a small house on the farm property, part of the broader sharecropping system that defined black rural life in the Mid-South during those decades. Anna Mae and her older sister Aline grew up in a world that asked everything of the people inside it and offered very little in return. When Anna Mae was still a young child, her parents' relationship fell apart. Her mother left first. Then her father left too, each of them moving away from Nutbush to build separate lives, leaving the two girls behind to be raised by their maternal grandmother, Georgie Curry. The abandonment was the foundational wound of Tina Turner's emotional life, a wound she never fully explained away, not in either of her memoirs, not in any of the interviews she gave across a 50-year public career. The fact of having been left by both parents before she was old enough to have done anything that might have explained it. She wrote about it with the directness that characterized everything she said about her life. The facts were what they were, and she carried them. Her grandmother raised her until her own death. After Georgie Curry died, Anna Mae went to live with her mother in St. Louis, Missouri, a move that, whatever its emotional complications, placed her in the center of one of the most musically fertile cities in America. The rhythm and blues clubs of St. Louis's black neighborhoods were alive with sounds that were transforming American music in the mid-1950s, and Anna Mae, who had grown up singing in church in Nutbush, was immediately drawn to all of it. She was in exactly the right city at exactly the right moment. And then she walked into a club one night and heard a band that made everything else go quiet. The man who made her and nearly destroyed her. His name was Isiah Luster Turner Jr., Ike Turner to everyone who knew him, and he was already a significant figure in the world he inhabited when Anna Mae Bullock first encountered him at Club Manhattan in St. Louis around 1957. Ike Turner had a legitimate claim to being one of the architects of rock and roll. His recording, Rocket 88, made with his band, the Kings of Rhythm, in 1951, and credited to Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, is considered by many music historians to be among the earliest recognizable rock and roll records. He was a guitarist, a band leader, a songwriter, and a producer who could hear what a song needed and knew how to extract it from his musicians through a combination of natural talent and relentless pressure. He had been working in music since he was a teenager in Clarksdale, Mississippi. By his mid-20s, he was running a band, producing sessions, and building a career with a focus and a discipline that would eventually consume everyone around him. He was 25 years old when Anna Mae Bullock encountered him. She was 17, still in high school. She had been watching the Kings of Rhythm perform at Club Manhattan before she ever spoke to Ike. going with her older sister Aline to see the band and falling in love with the music from the audience. One night, during a break in the set, someone handed the microphone to Anna May. What came out of her stopped everyone in the room. The particular quality of her voice, the power of it, the range, the way it carried emotion without ever losing control of the sound, was impossible to ignore. Ike Turner recognized immediately what he had heard. He was not sentimental about it. He was commercially minded in the way of someone who had been building his career since his teens and who understood exactly what a voice like that was worth to an act like his. He invited her to join the Kings of Rhythm, and she did, beginning a professional relationship that would gradually and then completely consume every other aspect of her life. The early years of their working relationship were not romantic. Ike was involved with a woman named Lorraine Taylor, with whom he had two sons, Ike Turner Jr., born in 1958, and Michael Turner, born in 1959. Anna May was performing with the band, becoming increasingly central to their sound, and living in the orbit of a man she both admired professionally and was beginning to fear in ways she did not fully understand at the time. The shift from professional to personal happened around 1960. Ike began a relationship with Anna May while he was still with Lorraine Taylor. Tina's own account of how that began emphasized the power imbalance between them. She was living under his roof, dependent on the band for her income and her housing, and in a situation where the line between encouragement and coercion was deliberately kept unclear. She was in no position to refuse what he wanted, and he knew it. She had already given birth to a son, Craig Raymond Turner, born in 1958, fathered by Raymond Hill, the band's saxophonist. Ike eventually adopted Craig. She was an 18-year-old single mother, entirely dependent on Ike's professional infrastructure. In 1960, they recorded their first hit together. A Fool in Love reached the top 5 on the R&B charts. The Ike and Tina Turner review was taking shape. In 1960, Ike renamed her. He decided that Anna Mae Bullock should instead be Tina Turner. Tina taken from a character in a Jungle comic book, Turner to match his own name. She accepted this too. The name Anna Mae Bullock was set aside. What stepped into its place was Tina Turner, a persona Ike had designed and that would grow, through decades of extraordinary work, into one of the most powerful names in music history. It was, from the beginning, a name that belonged partly to him. Their biological son together, Ronnie Turner, was born in October 1960, before the marriage. They married in Tijuana, Mexico, in 1962. Tina wrote in her memoir that she felt she had very little choice in the matter, that Ike had decided they would marry, and that declining was not something she felt she could do. He adopted her son, Craig. She eventually adopted his sons, Ike Jr. and Michael. The household they formed was a complicated mixture of professional obligation, children from multiple relationships, and a private life shaped entirely by what Ike wanted it to be. What followed across the next 16 years was a career of remarkable achievement, conducted alongside a private life of sustained terror. Inside the Review. The Ike and Tina Turner Review became one of the most celebrated live acts in American music. They toured constantly, 300 dates a year at certain points, covering the country in buses and vans, playing clubs, ballrooms, theaters, and eventually arenas. It was a grinding, relentless schedule that left almost no space for anything except the road and the stage, and it demanded a level of physical and psychological endurance that most performers would not have sustained for a week, let alone a decade. They opened for the Rolling Stones on their 1969 North American tour, an experience that introduced Tina to white rock audiences who had never encountered her before and who were left genuinely shaken by what they saw. Mick Jagger has said openly that he learned his stage presence from watching Tina. Keith Richards described first seeing her perform as one of the formative shocks of his musical life. The Stones were already one of the biggest acts in the world, and they were watching Tina Turner from the wings every night of that tour. The review's sound was its own category, a combustible mixture of soul, rhythm and blues, gospel, and something harder and more relentless than any of those labels fully captures. Tina's voice was the engine of all of it. She could move from tenderness to fury within a single phrase, could generate physical excitement in a room full of people through the specific quality of how she held a note, could communicate on a register that went past the intellectual and landed somewhere more fundamental. She was, as a live performer, among the greatest of her generation by almost any measure anyone cared to apply. The hits accumulated through the late 1960s and early 1970s. Proud Mary, the Creedence Clearwater Revival song that Ike and Tina transformed into something almost unrecognizable from its original, became their biggest commercial success, reaching number 4 on the pop charts in 1971 and earning them a Grammy Award for Best Rhythm and Blues Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group. Tina's spoken introduction to the song, describing how they always did things nice and easy before going nice and rough, became one of the most famous passages in live performance history, quoted and referenced for decades after. She was on every stage, in every photograph, at the center of every arrangement. She was Ike and Tina. The name was printed on the marquee, recorded on the albums, plastered across the tour buses. And yet she was receiving $25 a week in what Ike called pocket money, while he controlled every other financial arrangement connected to the act. She had signed whatever he put in front of her to sign. She did not fully understand, for years, the extent to which she had signed away the rights to her own name, her own recordings, and her own earning capacity. The legal arrangements surrounding the name Tina Turner were embedded in contracts that would create enormous difficulties when the time came to separate. She described the situation in her memoirs with the matter-of-fact quality that characterized everything she said about Ike. She didn't know what she had agreed to, because she had not been given the information or the freedom to refuse. She trusted the person who had built everything around her, and that trust was not reciprocated. And behind the scenes, behind the tours and the hits and the reviews and the Grammy Awards, the violence was escalating. What she endured. Tina Turner spoke publicly about what happened inside her marriage with Ike Turner in her 1986 autobiography, I, Tina, written with Kurt Loder, and then again in her 2018 memoir, My Love Story. She described it in specific, documented terms, not to seek sympathy, she was clear, but because the truth had been suppressed for too long, and because she believed that telling it might help other people who were living in situations they also couldn't see a way out of. The first incident of physical harm she described came early in their relationship, before the marriage, while she was still navigating the complicated territory of being a young performer entirely dependent on Ike's professional infrastructure. He struck her with a wooden shoe stretcher. She described the shock of it, the incomprehension that preceded the pain, the way she decided in that moment to stay rather than go, because she didn't know what going would look like, or whether she would survive it. The pattern that established itself from that point was one that those who have studied abusive relationships have since described as textbook in its structure, without diminishing the horror of the specific experience. There were periods of relative calm. There were gifts and gestures that followed the worst incidents. There were the professional bonds, the review, the recordings, the tours, that created what felt like a shared purpose and made the idea of leaving feel like dismantling everything she had built. And there was the fear. Consistent, managed, deliberate fear. He broke her jaw. He used her nose as a punching bag, she wrote, so many times that she could taste blood running down her throat when she sang. He threw hot coffee at her, causing burns. He would strike her on the head specifically, she noted, because he played guitar and knew not to damage his hands, which was its own particular revelation about the calculated nature of what he was doing. The physical harm happened before performances, after performances, in hotels, on tour buses, in their home. The review kept moving, and the violence moved with it. And the audiences who screamed at what Tina delivered on stage every night had no idea what she was carrying when she walked off. In her memoirs, she described reaching her lowest point and making a decision that she wrote about plainly in My Love Story. She obtained sleeping pills from a doctor, describing insomnia as the reason. At home, she took all 50 of them at once. She wrote that she was unhappy when she woke up, that she had genuinely wanted not to be alive at that moment. But she survived, and what she described coming out of that darkness with was a belief that she was meant to survive, that there was a reason she was still there. The Buddhist practices she had been introduced to by a friend named Valerie Bishop in the early 1970s became increasingly important to her in the years after that night. She began chanting, a practice connected to Nichiren Buddhism that she found gave her something she had never had in the marriage, a private, interior resource that Ike could not reach or control. She described it as the thing that saved her. July 1976, the night she ran. The final violent incident happened on July 1st, 1976, in a limousine on the way from Dallas/Fort Worth Airport to a Dallas hotel. They had been arguing before they even reached the car. Ike had been in a foul mood for days. On the highway to the hotel, with the city lights coming through the window and the driver in the front seat and the argument escalating past any containment, Ike attacked her in the back of the limousine. She fought back this time, which she had not always done before, and which was itself a measure of how something fundamental had shifted in her. She was done absorbing it. She was not going to pretend this was something she could continue to navigate. She arrived at the Statler Hilton Hotel with a swollen and bleeding face. She was, in her own words, wearing her blood on her clothes. The hotel was where they were supposed to stay for an upcoming performance. Instead of going to the room she was expected to share with Ike, she walked out of the hotel, crossed the highway on foot, and walked into the Ramada Inn across the road. She had 36 cents in her pocket. She had no credit cards. She had no cash beyond those coins. She had no identification of any practical significance. She had the stage name that Ike had given her, and the voice in her body that was, and had always been, entirely her own. The Ramada Inn clerk looked at the woman standing in front of him, bloodied, carrying almost nothing, and gave her a room. She called a friend and business associate named Nate Tabor, who wired her money and began making calls on her behalf. She stayed hidden. The fact that she had finally left did not mean she was immediately safe. Ike had the infrastructure of their entire professional and domestic life. He had resources and connections, and a history of ensuring she understood the consequences of trying to break free. She was careful and afraid, and absolutely certain she was not going back. She filed for divorce later that year, citing irreconcilable differences. The divorce was finalized in March 1978. As part of the settlement, and this part of the story carries its own particular weight, Tina was willing to give up virtually everything that the review had generated: rights to recordings, publishing rights, financial assets, the material accumulation of 16 years. She gave up almost all of it. She kept two things: the name Tina Turner, which Ike had created, but which had, by 1978, become the most commercially valuable thing attached to the partnership, and the right to tell her own story in her own voice. Ike reportedly let her keep the name, partly because he didn't believe she could do anything significant with it without him. That calculation was wrong in a way that would become one of the more satisfying ironies in the history of popular music. She was 38 years old. She had no money. She had a name, and she intended to use it. The long climb back. The years between 1978 and 1984 were the years that very few people in the music industry believed in Tina Turner. She performed wherever she could book herself. Las Vegas lounges, small supper clubs, the kind of venues that were a significant step down from opening for the Rolling Stones. She covered songs from other artists and performed with a backing band she assembled on whatever budget was available. She was starting from well below zero in financial terms. The settlement from the divorce had left her with the name and the right to tell her story, but very little cash. She had debts from the review era that were now her individual obligation. Some of those debts required immediate attention, which meant taking every available booking regardless of venue or fee. She described the Las Vegas lounge circuit with clear eyes and without self-pity in her memoirs. She was playing to small audiences in hotel showrooms. She was, in professional terms, a name that people recognized as belonging to someone who had once been significant. The music industry of the late 1970s and early 1980s was not organized around second chances for middle-aged black women. The people who ran record labels had very specific ideas about what kind of artist got invested in, and Tina Turner, as an independent entity, did not match any of those ideas. She continued the Buddhist practice she had developed in the final years of the marriage. She chanted every morning and every evening. She described it as the method by which she sustained her belief in her own future during the years when almost no external evidence supported that belief. She had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, by people in the industry that her time had passed. She continued to chant and to believe that they were wrong. Roger Davies, an Australian music manager who had worked with Olivia Newton-John and a number of other significant artists, agreed to manage her in 1980. He was the first person in years who looked at Tina Turner and saw not a comeback act, but a star. Not someone who needed to be carefully handled back toward relevance, but someone who was genuinely great and simply needed the right vehicle and the right moment. He told her directly that he believed she could be bigger than she had ever been. He meant it. In 1983, Tina recorded a cover of Al Green's Let's Stay Together that was released in the United Kingdom and became a meaningful hit on British charts and in European markets. The label Capitol Records in the United States paid attention to the European reception. The result was an album called Private Dancer, recorded in the United Kingdom and released in May 1984. The album sold 12 million copies worldwide. What's Love Got to Do with It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first #1 hit of her solo career. And it did so when Tina Turner was 44 years old. She won 4 Grammy Awards at the February 1985 ceremony, including Record of the Year and Song of the Year. She appeared on the cover of virtually every major music publication in America and Europe simultaneously. The world, in 1984, effectively discovered Tina Turner as a solo artist and discovered that she was, on her own terms, even better than she had been in any previous form. She was 44 years old. She had spent her 30s starting over from near nothing, playing lounges and touring on thin margins. And she had arrived at the biggest moment of her professional life. The personal life was still largely empty in the way that matters most. She was famous, finally on her own terms, financially secure, and building toward things she had long imagined. And she was alone. The next chapter would begin not in a recording studio or on a stage, but at an airport in Germany. The airport and the man who changed everything. In 1986, Tina Turner arrived at Dusseldorf Airport in Germany on a European promotional tour for her new album. Her European record label, EMI, sent a representative to meet her. His name was Erwin Bach. He was 30 years old, 16 years younger than Tina, who was 46. He was German, quiet, self-possessed, and completely unprepared for what meeting Tina Turner in person was going to do to him. She was equally unprepared for him. She described the first time she saw him at the airport with language that she said surprised her even as she was experiencing it. Something immediate and certain that she had not felt about anyone in quite that way. She noticed him before she knew who he was or why he was there. He was just standing there, she said in her second memoir. And something happened. They did not begin dating immediately. Tina was cautious in ways that her history made entirely reasonable. She was also, at 46, someone who had spent years rebuilding herself specifically to be a person who did not rush into things because they felt overwhelming. She had been in therapy in the comeback years, had done serious internal work, and understood her own patterns well enough to know that the feeling of certainty about someone new required time to be tested rather than simply trusted. They became friends first. She was touring extensively. The Private Dancer album had launched her into a global touring schedule that put her on stage in arenas on multiple continents. Erwin was working. They saw each other when the professional schedules created opportunities, which was not often. Gradually and deliberately, the friendship became something else. Tina wrote about falling in love with Erwin Bach as an experience unlike anything she had previously known. Not the entanglement and dependency of the relationship with Ike, not the professional power dynamic, not the feeling of being managed or assessed or owned. Something she described as mutual and quiet and real. He wanted nothing from her professionally. He had his own career and his own standing. He did not need her to be Tina Turner in order to be himself. He was, she said, the first man who had ever truly seen the woman underneath everything else. Not the star, not the asset, not the name on the tour bus. The woman who had grown up in Nutbush, Tennessee, who had been left by both parents before she was old enough to understand why, who had spent 16 years performing under conditions that almost killed her, and who had crawled out of all of it with 36 cents and a borrowed hotel room and the absolute conviction that she was meant to survive. He saw all of that, and he stayed. They dated for 23 years before they married. The length of that courtship was not indecision. It was Tina making absolutely sure. She had one marriage behind her that had taken nearly everything. She was not going to formalize anything until she was completely, unambiguously certain. They lived together. They built a life together. The marriage, when it came, was simply the legal acknowledgement of something that had been real for 2 decades. Erwin Bach, The Life She Deserved. Erwin Johann Bach was born on January 24, 1956, in Cologne, Germany. He studied at the Cologne Technical University and built a career in the music industry, eventually rising to a senior executive position at EMI Music, the European record label division that had distributed Tina's work in the region during her comeback years. He was accomplished on his own terms. Not a star, not a performer, not someone whose identity was defined by proximity to a famous person. He had his own professional life, his own standing, his own reason to be in any room he walked into. The years of their courtship were documented mostly in their absence from public record, which was itself a statement. Tina Turner, who had spent the entirety of her adult life being visible whether she chose to be or not, now had a private life that was genuinely private. Irwin made that possible, partly by being the kind of person who did not need or seek the spotlight, and partly by creating an environment in which Tina could simply exist without performing. They built a life in Küsnacht, Switzerland, a small, quiet town on the eastern shore of Lake Zurich. Tina had fallen in love with Europe during her comeback years, and specifically with the quality of life she found in Switzerland, where she could walk to the market without being surrounded, where the scale of daily existence was manageable and human, and nothing like the perpetual spectacle of her American public life. She became a Swiss resident in 1994. She renounced her American citizenship in 2013, becoming a Swiss citizen entirely, and said afterward that she felt completely at home there. She and Erwin married on July 21st, 2013, at their home in Küsnacht, on the shores of Lake Zurich. She was 73 years old. He was 57. They had been together for 27 years by the time they formalized what had long been their marriage in every meaningful sense. The ceremony was private, family and close friends, no press, and Tina wore a white gown with a veil that trailed behind her. The photographs that emerged from that day showed a woman who looked, simply and unmistakably, happy. Roger Davies, the manager who had believed in her in 1980, was among those present. He described the event as one of the most joyful days he had witnessed in a life spent in the company of remarkable people. The years in Switzerland and what they meant. The final decade of Tina Turner's life was shaped by both profound difficulty and, within that difficulty, genuine peace. In 2009, she retired from live touring following her Tina 50th anniversary tour, which had broken records for a solo female performer and brought her to audiences in stadiums across multiple continents one final time. She was 69 years old and had been performing professionally for over 50 years. The retirement was not a retreat. It was a completion. She had done everything she had set out to do and more, on her own terms, and she was ready for a different kind of life. In 2012, she had a stroke. She described the recovery process, relearning basic physical functions, the disruption to a body that had been one of her primary instruments for 7 decades. With the same plain-spokenness she brought to everything difficult. It was hard. She did the work. In 2016, she was diagnosed with intestinal cancer. In 2017, her kidney function began failing, a condition her doctors attributed in part to the long-term use of blood pressure medication that had been damaging her kidneys over time without the extent of the harm being recognized early enough. In 2017, Irwin donated one of his kidneys to save her life. The donation was the defining act of the marriage. It was, by any measure, the most complete expression of commitment that one person can make toward another. The literal giving of a part of one's own body to keep someone you love alive. Tina described it in her memoir with words that acknowledged what it meant, without diminishing it through sentimentality. He did it because he loved her. He did it because a life without her was something he was not willing to accept, as long as there was an alternative. She recovered. They continued their life in Küsnacht. They had the lake, the roses she had planted in the garden, the privacy she had spent decades earning, and the quiet that had always been the most extraordinary luxury available to someone who had spent 50 years being watched. In December 2022, Tina's son, Ronnie, the biological child she had shared with Ike, born in 1960, died from complications of colon cancer at the age of 62. It was the second time she had lost a son. Her eldest, Craig, born in 1958 before the marriage to Ike and carried alongside everything that had followed, had died in July 2018 at the age of 59 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. She had mourned both of them publicly, with a restraint that honored their privacy even in grief. Tina Turner died on May 24th, 2023, at her home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, after a long illness. She was 83 years old. Irwin was beside her. The statement issued by her team was brief and formal. The response from the world was neither brief nor formal. It was the specific, genuine grief of people who had loved someone who had given them something real. What the two marriages were. The two marriages of Tina Turner are, in the end, not just a story about love and suffering. They are a story about what a person can survive, and what a person deserves, and what it sometimes takes to get from one to the other. The first marriage was not a marriage in any sense she had freely chosen. It was a professional arrangement, built on an enormous power imbalance and maintained through fear. She stayed for 16 years not because she didn't know what was happening to her, she knew, but because the practical architecture of her life had been constructed to make leaving seem impossible. She had no money of her own, no legal rights to the name or the recordings, no independent professional existence. She had children woven into the household. She had a body carrying the cumulative damage of sustained harm, and a mind processing the specific distortions that come from living inside a situation where someone with total authority over your circumstances insists that you are the problem. She left with 36 cents and walked across a highway. She built everything that followed from that crossing. The comeback years, the Grammy Awards, the sold-out world tours, the financial independence, the Swiss citizenship, the house by Lake Zurich. All of it came from a woman who had chosen to start over from nothing rather than continue to be destroyed by something. The second marriage was the reward that the first made her capable of receiving. Not because suffering earns love, it doesn't. And Tina Turner's years with Ike were not a necessary precondition for anything good that came after. But because the person Tina became, through the work she did on herself, through the Buddhist practice that gave her an interior life Ike could never reach, through the therapy she pursued in the comeback years, through the 23-year courtship with Irwin that she refused to rush, was a person who knew exactly what she needed and was not willing to settle for anything less. Erwin Bach gave a kidney when she needed one. He gave 23 years of courtship before a wedding ring. He gave privacy and quiet, and the specific gift of being loved for who you actually are, rather than what you represent or what you generate. He gave her a life in Switzerland, with roses in the garden and the lake visible from the window, far from Nutbush and the review and the limousine on the highway to Dallas, far from the 36 cents. Tina Turner spoke, in the final years of her life, about peace. Not the peace of someone who had resolved everything or who had found a way to erase what had happened. The peace of someone who had decided that what had been done to her was not going to define what she became. She had chanted her way through the worst years. She had crawled through the 1970s on credit she didn't have. She had stood on the stage of the 1985 Grammys and accepted 4 awards for work she had made entirely on her own terms. She had fallen in love at an airport in Dusseldorf at 46 years old and had the wisdom to take her time about it. She deserved all of it. She earned all of it, across a life that asked more of her than it had any right to ask, and that she met every single time, with a capacity for survival that most people would never be required to demonstrate. The last photographs taken of her alive are quiet ones. A woman in her 80s, in a comfortable house beside a Swiss lake, in the company of a man who loved her, tending the garden she had planted. She looks, in those photographs, like exactly what she was. Someone who had travelled an extraordinary distance to arrive in a place that was, finally, entirely her own. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She was one of the most beloved actresses in Hollywood history. She had 3 Academy Award nominations before she turned 30. She was married twice to the same man. And between those 2 marriages, a discovery she made at home shattered something in her that therapy, success, and years of rebuilding never entirely fixed. What happened inside the marriages of Natalie Wood, behind the glamour and the fan magazine covers and the fairy tale public romance, is a story of a woman who loved deeply, was hurt profoundly, and who spent her life searching for the kind of stability that the world she lived in made nearly impossible to find. This is the story of Natalie Wood's marriages. The girl who was always performing. Before the marriages, before the love stories, there was a child who had never been allowed to simply be a child. Natalie Wood was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco, California, to Russian immigrant parents. Her father, Nikolai, was a carpenter who had crossed the Pacific from Russia with very little and built a modest, stable life in the American West. Her mother, Maria, was something else entirely, a woman of fierce ambition and a fixed belief that her daughter had been destined for something extraordinary. Maria had heard a fortune-teller's prophecy before leaving Russia, that she would give birth to a famous daughter. She spent the rest of her life making sure the prophecy came true. Maria pushed Natalie into performing almost before she was old enough to walk steadily. By 4, the child was appearing in front of cameras. At 6, she appeared in her first film, a small role in Happyland in 1943. At 8, she played Susan Walker, the skeptical, clear-eyed little girl in Miracle on 34th Street, and delivered a performance of such naturalness that it startled adults in the audience who expected children to perform rather than simply be present. What they were watching was not acting in any technical sense. It was a child who had been taught from her earliest memory to read a room and respond to what it required, to become whatever the moment called for. Maria's management of Natalie's career was total. She chose the roles. She accompanied her on every set. She cultivated relationships with directors and producers with the systematic thoroughness of someone running a business. She kept the household financially dependent on Natalie's income in ways that made it effectively impossible for Natalie to refuse work or to step away from the industry, even briefly, even when she needed to. Natalie later described to her therapist a childhood in which she had never simply been herself. She had always been performing, on camera, at home for her mother, for the world that had been watching her since she was 4 years old. What Maria also passed along, alongside the ambition and the discipline, was a terror, a specific, physical, deeply embedded terror of dark water. Maria had heard, or believed she had heard, or perhaps constructed from a vague anxiety, a prophecy that her beautiful daughter would one day die in dark water. She communicated this to Natalie with enough force and frequency that the fear became part of Natalie's nervous system. She was afraid of pools. She was afraid of the ocean at night. She talked about the fear in interviews throughout her career, always with a note of self-conscious humor that didn't quite conceal the genuine dread underneath it. Near the water, she would say. Not in the water. She had a specific reason for the fear beyond her mother's prophecy. When Natalie was 10 years old, filming The Green Promise in 1949, a scene required her to cross a bridge over turbulent water. The bridge was rigged to collapse on cue as a dramatic effect. Her mother told her it was safe. When Natalie reached the bridge, it collapsed, and she was thrown into the rushing water below. She was pulled out quickly, physically unhurt, but the experience left a fracture in her relationship with moving water that only deepened over the following decades. Some of her close friends believed the fear was one of the few things she never found a way to fully manage. despite years of therapy and deliberate self-examination. As a teenager, she made the transition from child actress to serious dramatic performer, a move that most child stars fail to make, and that Natalie navigated through a combination of genuine talent, intense personal determination, and the professional connections her mother had spent years building. She competed for and won roles that would go to adult actresses. She studied her craft with real seriousness. She read plays and poetry and worked to develop the interior life that distinguishes a genuine actor from a performer who simply knows where to stand and when to speak. By her mid-teens, she had been recognized by directors as someone capable of inhabiting emotional complexity on screen. At 15, she appeared in Rebel Without a Cause alongside James Dean, who was 19 years older than her, and held her own in scenes that required her to convey the full weight of adolescent desperation and longing. She received an Academy Award nomination. She was not yet 17 years old. At 18, she went on a date with a young actor named Robert Wagner, and the world she had built her entire identity around shifted on its axis in ways she could not yet understand. Robert Wagner and the First Fairy Tale. Robert Wagner was 26 when he met Natalie Wood on an arranged date at a Hollywood party in 1956. He was tall, conventionally handsome in the way that the 1950s studio system valued and promoted, and possessed of a natural ease in social situations that was its own form of charm. He was under contract at 20th Century Fox, making westerns and adventure films that kept his name on the marquee without fully testing whatever he was capable of. He was charming in the uncomplicated way that the era rewarded. Natalie had carried a crush on him since she was 10 years old. She had seen his photograph in a fan magazine and told her mother, in the direct and certain way of children, that she intended to marry him when she grew up. Maria had apparently not forgotten the declaration. When the opportunity arose to arrange a meeting years later, she reportedly helped engineer it. When it finally happened, Natalie was 18 and Wagner was 8 years older, and the chemistry between them was immediate enough that they left the party together and stayed in each other's orbit for the next year. They dated through 1956 and 1957, and the romance was covered by the fan magazines with an enthusiasm that reflected the industry's recognition that they were the ideal public couple. The young blonde actress who had grown up on screen and the dashing leading man, both photogenic, both at the right stage of their respective careers to generate maximum public interest. The Hollywood machinery of the 1950s understood celebrity pairings as products to be managed and sold, and Natalie and Wagner were among the finest examples of that product available. They married on December 28, 1957. Natalie was 19 years old. Wagner was 27. The ceremony took place in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the press coverage was extensive and rapturous. They honeymooned on a rented yacht, a detail that carries its own complicated irony in the light of everything that followed, and set up home together in Beverly Hills. The early years of the marriage looked, from the outside, exactly as the fan magazines described them. A golden Hollywood couple at the beginning of their lives together, young and beautiful and visibly happy. But from the inside, the pressures were significant and arriving from multiple directions simultaneously. The central imbalance was professional, and it grew steadily as the years passed. When they married, both were rising stars. Within a few years, Natalie's career accelerated into a different orbit entirely, while Wagner's remained at the level it had occupied when they married. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for Rebel Without a Cause in 1955. In 1961, she would be nominated for Best Actress for Splendor in the Grass. In 1963, She would be nominated again for Love with the Proper Stranger. 3 Academy Award nominations by the time she was 24 years old. She was one of the most commercially successful and critically respected actresses of her generation, and every film she made seemed to confirm and deepen that standing. Wagner's career, meanwhile, was not progressing at the same pace. He was working, and working steadily, but his trajectory had plateaued in ways that were obvious to anyone in the industry, which meant they were obvious to him. He acknowledged, in the HBO documentary about Natalie made in 2020, that the gap between their respective career trajectories created real tension, not conscious resentment on his part, he said, but a pressure that accumulated in the household, whether either of them named it or not. His career was not igniting the way hers was, he said, and even though that wasn't the principal reason they eventually separated, it was part of the atmosphere in which everything else happened. But the professional imbalance, real as it was not the deepest fault line in the marriage. The discovery that changed everything. In 1961, not long after Natalie had completed work on Splendor in the Grass, the first marriage to Robert Wagner ended suddenly and in circumstances that were kept private for decades. The public version of events, the version that fan magazines reported and that neither Wagner nor Natalie directly challenged at the time, was that the marriage had broken down under the pressures of their respective careers, and that Natalie had been involved with her Splendor in the Grass co-star, Warren Beatty. The Beatty affair story circulated widely and persistently. Natalie did not confirm it. She did not deny it. She allowed it to stand as the explanation for a collapse that had a very different explanation, and it became, over time, accepted as the truth by an industry and a public that had no reason to look for another version. But it was not the truth. The true account of what ended the first marriage, as documented by biographer Suzanne Finstad in her extensively researched biography of Natalie Wood, and supported by reporting from multiple sources, including the actress's own sister Lana Wood, was something entirely different. Natalie had come home to find her husband in an intimate encounter with another person. The person was a man. The shock of the discovery, in her own home, without any warning or preparation, without any framework for understanding what she was seeing, was not simply the shock of infidelity. It was the shock of discovering that a central aspect of the person she had married was something she had never known and had never been given the chance to consider. The people around Wagner, including some of Natalie's close friends, had apparently heard rumors before the marriage. Natalie apparently had not, or had not been in a position to hear them. Her biographer, Suzanne Finstad, described the discovery as something that nearly cost Natalie her life. She had not merely been devastated in the ordinary way of a marriage ending. She had been destabilized at the level of her most basic trust in her own perception of reality. The man she had loved since she was 10 years old, the marriage she had constructed as the anchor of her adult identity, had been built on a foundation that was not what she had understood it to be, and the ground beneath everything she thought she knew had given way. She publicly took the fall for the marriage's end. She allowed the narrative of the Warren Beatty affair to circulate and deepen unchallenged, protecting Wagner's image and his career at the cost of her own reputation. The tabloids ran with the story across years. She said nothing to correct it. Wagner has denied the account in its most specific details in the years since it became public. He has never addressed it directly in any documentary or interview that dealt with the marriage's end. The truth of exactly what happened in that house in 1961 belongs to the people who were present, and Natalie Wood is no longer alive to speak to it. What is documented in the aftermath is the scale of her collapse. She went into psychoanalysis, intensive, multiple times weekly, for years. She later described her therapy bills with dark humor as being roughly equivalent to the annual defense budget of a small country. She threw herself back into work. She took on West Side Story in 1961, Gypsy in 1962, Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963. Film after film, year after year, the relentlessness of it suggesting someone who needed the structure of a set and the requirement of a performance to hold herself together when nothing else quite could. But the wound ran deep, and the man who had made it would eventually be the same man she came back to. The years between, Warren Beatty, the dark year, and the search for stability. The period between Natalie's divorce from Wagner in 1962 and her second marriage in 1969 was, by almost any measure, the most turbulent stretch of her adult life. She was working at a relentless pace, producing some of the finest performances of her career, and simultaneously navigating a personal life that had lost its organizing center and was looking for a new one. She did have a relationship with Warren Beatty after her marriage ended, the irony being that the affair the public had assumed destroyed the marriage only began after it was already over. Beatty was 24 in 1962, already known in Hollywood as one of the most compelling and difficult presences in the industry, and the relationship between him and Natalie had a combustible quality that the people around them found simultaneously fascinating and exhausting. He moved into her house at one point. They argued. They separated. They found their way back to each other. They separated again. It had none of the careful management of her marriage to Wagner, and all of the raw, unmediated intensity of two people with enormous careers, enormous personalities, and enormous needs in close proximity to each other. Their involvement lasted on and off through the early 1960s, and during those years, Natalie continued making films at a pace that suggested she was using work as a way of organizing time that would otherwise have been more difficult to inhabit. West Side Story in 1961. Gypsy in 1962, Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963, which earned her third Academy Award nomination. She was one of the most productive and respected actresses in Hollywood during a period when her private life was in genuine turmoil. The two realities existed in almost perfect parallel. By the mid-1960s, she was no longer in a relationship with Beatty and was not in any settled partnership. She was dating, socializing actively, attending events. She was also in intensive psychotherapy, 5 sessions per week at certain points, and making genuine progress on the complicated architecture of her own psychology. She understood more about herself at 27 than she had at 19. She was not yet at peace with all of it, but she was looking directly at it, which was more than most people in her world managed to do. In 1966, Beatty appeared at her home unexpectedly. He had come to offer her the role of Bonnie Parker in a film he was producing alongside director Arthur Penn, a project that would become Bonnie and Clyde, one of the most influential American films of the decade. The role of Bonnie Parker was the kind of role that makes careers. Dangerous, sexually charged, emotionally extreme, and narratively central in a way that most female roles of the era were not. Natalie turned it down. She later said she turned it down because she didn't believe she could do it justice, that she wasn't confident she had what the role required. The role went to Faye Dunaway and made her a star. The visit from Beatty, the role she passed on, the particular weight of encountering him again at a moment when her life felt unmoored, whatever the combination of factors was, the night ended badly. Natalie took an overdose of barbiturates. She was found and taken to a hospital. She told her sister Lana, afterward, that she had not wanted to be alive at that moment. She recovered physically. She returned to therapy. She went back to work. She processed what had happened with the same methodical commitment she brought to understanding everything else about herself. And she moved forward. By 1968 and 1969, she was genuinely rebuilding. She made Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, a sophisticated adult comedy drama about marriage and intimacy and the performative nature of both, that became one of the most talked about films of its year. She was socializing actively, attending events with the particular energy of someone who has survived something and wants the world to know it without making a speech about it. And at one of those events, through a mutual friend, she met a British film producer named Richard Gregson. Richard Gregson, The Marriage That Was Supposed to Work. Richard Gregson was a British film producer and theatrical agent who had made a name for himself working with significant talent on both sides of the Atlantic. He was thoughtful, articulate, and operating from a professional world that overlapped with Hollywood without being entirely consumed by it. He had a kind of settled intelligence that was different from the charged, competitive atmosphere that surrounded most of the men Natalie had known professionally. The connection between them came through Robert Redford, who was both a close friend of Natalie's and a professional client of Gregson's. Redford was his acting client in those years, and Gregson had helped guide his early career with considerable skill. They dated seriously for 2 years, which was considerably longer than the courtship period of either of Natalie's other marriages. The extended dating period was deliberate on Natalie's part. She had learned something from the marriage to Wagner about the cost of choosing a partner without fully knowing him, and she was not in a hurry this time. She wanted to be certain. She had spent enough years in therapy to understand what her own patterns were, and she was working to make a different kind of choice than the ones she had made before. They married in May 1969. Redford served as best man. The wedding was a small, private affair compared to the media event of her first marriage, a reflection both of the different decade and of Natalie's different relationship with her own public image at 30 than she had possessed at 19. Their daughter, Natasha, was born on September 29th, 1970, and the arrival of the baby transformed Natalie in ways that the people close to her found striking and genuinely moving. She had always been warm and socially engaged, but motherhood activated something specific in her, a focus and a tenderness and a sense of purpose that settled her in ways that years of psychoanalysis had not quite managed on its own. She had wanted children for years. Now she had one. She was completely present. Gregson later acknowledged, in the HBO documentary, that Natalie's total absorption in Natasha was part of what went wrong in the marriage. He felt, not unreasonably, he conceded, that there was no longer room for him in the picture as she was painting it. He began an affair with Natalie's personal secretary. Natalie found out. The source of how she discovered it varies between accounts. Some say she overheard a phone conversation, others describe a more direct confrontation. What is documented is her response. She told Gregson to leave and had police patrol the house for a week afterward to ensure he didn't come back. The move was decisive and without ambiguity. She was not going to negotiate with infidelity, not again. The divorce was finalized in 1972. Gregson returned to England. Their daughter Natasha, named with a version of Natalie's own mother's original name as a quiet tribute, would be raised by Natalie and, eventually, by Wagner, who adopted her when he and Natalie remarried, giving the child his name and his daily presence in the way that her biological father, across an ocean, could not. The reunion, the second marriage to Wagner. When Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner found each other again in 1972, they were both in their 30s and had both come through their respective post-divorce years bearing the evidence of what they had been through. Wagner had married actress Marion Marshall in 1963, not long after his divorce from Natalie. They had a daughter together, Katie, born in 1964. That marriage had also ended in divorce in 1971. Wagner was, by the early 1970s, finding more consistent success in television than he had on the big screen. It Takes a Thief had made him a recognizable and well-regarded figure on American television. But he had been living, in some ways, in the shadow of a marriage that had never been entirely put to rest. The reconnection happened at a party in Palm Springs in 1972. Both of them were newly single, both of them still carrying unresolved emotional weight from a relationship that had ended in ways that neither of them had been able to fully close. Natalie accepted an invitation to his house afterward. They talked in the way of two people who had known each other for 15 years and had a great deal of accumulated history to work through, about their marriages, about what had gone wrong and why, about what they understood now that they hadn't understood in their 20s. Natalie later told friends that what she encountered in that conversation was a man who had genuinely changed. The first time, she said, she had married a boy. This time she was meeting a man. The decade apart had done what the marriage itself could not. It had given both of them enough experience and enough pain and enough development to be capable of a different kind of relationship. She was 33 years old. She had been through the collapse of the first marriage, through the Beatty years, through the overdose, through years of intensive therapy, through a second marriage, and its infidelity and its end. She had worked on herself in ways that were real and visible to people who knew her. She was not the 19-year-old who had married for the first time in Scottsdale. They remarried in July 1972, on a boat, again, in the particular way that the water kept appearing in the margins of her life, with very little fanfare compared to the spectacle of the first wedding. They chose the Academy Awards ceremony earlier that year as their first public appearance as a reunited couple, arriving together before the remarriage was publicly official. And the response from Hollywood was warm in the way that people respond to a love story that seemed finished but turned out not to be. Courtney Brooke Wagner was born on March 9th, 1974, the only biological child they shared together. The household they built through the 1970s was, by the accounts of everyone who spent time in it, a genuinely warm one. Natalie threw herself into homemaking with the same total energy she had always brought to performance. The holiday celebrations were elaborate. The birthday parties were productions. She read fairy tales at bedtime. She was present. She was, by most accounts, genuinely happy, or close enough to happy that the distinction was not visible to the people she loved. Her career began to stir again in the mid-1970s. She appeared in a television version of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1976, opposite Wagner, and critics responded warmly to seeing them together on screen. She began work on Brainstorm, a science fiction film directed by Douglas Trumbull, co-starring Christopher Walken. The production of Brainstorm brought Walken into the close orbit of the family. He and Natalie had a genuine and warm working relationship. Wagner, by the accounts of those who knew the situation, had complicated feelings about the intensity of Walken's professional presence in his wife's life and, increasingly, in their personal circle. Those tensions were present on the Thanksgiving weekend of 1981, when the three of them, along with the Splendor's captain Dennis Davon, took the yacht to Catalina Island for the holiday. The last weekend. Natalie Wood died on November 29, 1981, in the waters off Catalina Island, California. She was 43 years old. She was found floating in the water near the island in the early morning, wearing a red down jacket over her nightgown. The jacket, waterlogged, would have made staying above water extremely difficult. The official cause of death was drowning. The manner of death was initially recorded as accidental. It was later changed to undetermined by the Los Angeles County coroner following the reopening of the investigation in 2011. The people aboard the yacht that night were Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and the Splendor's captain, Dennis Davin. The sequence of events as told by Wagner and the sequence as told by Davin differ in significant ways, particularly regarding the timeline of when Natalie was discovered missing and when calls for help were made. The investigation was officially reopened in 2011. In 2018, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department named Robert Wagner as a person of interest, a designation that falls short of suspect, but indicates he is believed to have information material to understanding what happened. Wagner has maintained that he does not know what happened to his wife and that he did not harm her. No charges have ever been filed. The case remains open. The truth of those hours on the Splendor in November 1981 has not been established to the satisfaction of either the legal system or the investigators who have continued to examine it. What is established, and what carries its own particular weight in the context of Natalie's life, is this. The woman who had been afraid of dark water since childhood, who had described the fear openly in interviews for decades, who would not enter a swimming pool, and who spoke about the phobia with the directness of someone who had learned to live alongside it rather than overcome it. That woman was found in the dark water off Catalina on a November night. The fear she had carried her entire life was the thing that ultimately found her. The women she became between the marriages. There is a dimension of Natalie Wood's story that the narrative of marriages and love affairs sometimes crowds out. The woman she was building between and beneath all of it, through deliberate effort and sustained self-examination. The psychoanalysis she began after the first divorce from Wagner was not simply a crisis response to a painful ending. It became one of the central projects of her adult life, something she continued, at various levels of frequency and intensity, for the rest of her years. She attended sessions multiple times weekly at certain points, and held to the work even when it was difficult, and even when it cost her more emotionally than she had anticipated. She read voraciously about psychology and human behavior. She came to understand, over years of careful examination, that her own patterns had deep roots. The way her mother's management of her childhood had made it difficult to separate her own desires from what others needed her to want. The way the terror around water was connected to a specific set of experiences rather than simply being an irrational phobia. The way the discovery that ended her first marriage had restructured her basic capacity to trust what she thought she knew about the people she loved. She made a specific and important distinction in her own thinking about the water fear. She loved the ocean from a distance. She loved yachts. She loved sitting near the water and watching it move in the late afternoon light, and feeling the particular quality of silence that exists close to open water. She was simply terrified of being in it, of the darkness of it at night, of the cold, of the specific physical experience of submersion. She worked in therapy to understand the origins of the fear without quite managing to dissolve it. The fear stayed. She lived alongside it with the self-awareness of someone who knew exactly where it came from. She was also, in her professional life, someone who had made genuinely interesting and non-obvious choices throughout her career. The roles she took on across 20 years of film work were not the reflexive ones for a woman of her beauty and her commercial appeal. She played a Puerto Rican girl in West Side Story, a role that required her to occupy a world and a background entirely different from her own. She played a woman who becomes pregnant outside of marriage, in love with the proper stranger, bringing a moral complexity to the character that another actress might have softened into sentiment. She played a married woman navigating questions about intimacy and commitment in Bob, and Carol and Ted and Alice. She was not only choosing glamorous roles, she was choosing roles that required her to inhabit complicated emotional situations and find the truth of them without the protection of easy sympathy. Brainstorm, the film she was completing at the time of her death, represented another kind of professional ambition: science fiction, a genre she had never worked in before, exploring ideas about consciousness, memory, and what it means to experience another person's inner life. She was 43 years old and still choosing work that pushed her into unfamiliar territory rather than settling into the commercial comfort of the image she had already established. She was also, by the accounts of those who spent time with her in the final decade of her life, genuinely happy in ways that had not always been available to her. The second marriage to Wagner had given her a domestic stability that she valued with an urgency born from knowing what its absence looked like. The daughters she was raising, Natasha and then Courtney, were the organizing center of her daily life in a way that seemed to genuinely fulfill something in her that the career alone had never reached. The figure who walked onto the splendor for the Thanksgiving weekend of 1981 was a woman who had spent decades being shaped by forces outside her control, a mother who had never stopped managing her, an industry that had never stopped watching her, relationships that had cost her in ways she had spent years processing. She had survived all of it. She had come through the darkest moments and built something real. She had the film career, the marriage she wanted, the daughters she loved. She was 43 years old. She was afraid of dark water, and she had gone out on a yacht for the holiday weekend with her husband and her co-star. What her marriages were. Looking at the full arc of Natalie Wood's marriages, the first to Wagner, the second to Gregson, the third back to Wagner, the picture that emerges is of a woman who was always reaching for a specific thing that the life she lived made extremely difficult to obtain. She wanted to be known, not seen. She had been seen since she was 4 years old. Seen, in Hollywood, is a passive thing that happens to you. Known is different. Known means someone has looked past the performance and found the actual person and chosen to stay. Maria Zakharenko had seen her daughter as a vehicle for a destiny. The industry had seen her as a product to be managed and marketed. The first Wagner marriage had been built on a foundation that turned out to be different from what she understood it to be. The Beatty relationship had been too combustible to become anything stable. Gregson had chosen his secretary. The second Wagner marriage had worked, and had given her more of what she was looking for than anything else she had found, and had lasted until the water took her. The story of Natalie Wood's marriages is not simply a story of romantic misfortune. It is a story of a woman with enormous gifts who had been formed, from the earliest age, by a set of circumstances that made intimacy complicated and trust genuinely difficult. She had spent her entire childhood performing. She had been taught to read rooms and respond to what a situation required, rather than to simply be who she was. She had been given, by her mother, a fear of dark water as a literal inheritance, and she had worked on all of it. She had spent decades in therapy. She had made genuine changes. She had built something real in the second marriage to Wagner, something with daughters and birthday parties and Russian fairy tales and holiday celebrations that Natasha and Courtney have described, in interviews and in the documentary, with a warmth that is unmistakably true. She had done everything she could, and she was still, in the end, found in the dark water. The mystery of her death has kept the story alive in ways that a simpler ending might not have. The investigation continues. The questions continue. Wagner's refusal to cooperate with investigators continues. The answers have not come. What has come, in the years since, in the documentary that Natasha made, in the accounts her daughters have given, in the words of the people who knew her, is a portrait of a woman who was considerably more than a mystery. She was warm and funny and physically affectionate and entirely present for the people she loved. She celebrated everything. She read poetry. She was afraid of dark water. She deserved better than the specific way she died. She deserved, really, the ordinary thing that had always been the most extraordinary thing available to her: to grow old with people who knew and loved her, in a house full of noise and life, and the celebrations she made into something lavish simply because she believed occasions deserved it. That is the tragic story of Natalie Wood's marriages. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.